اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear students, I hope and pray inshallah you are all well. We continue with the Durul Mukhtar from Kitab al-Buyu'. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قال المصنف رحمه الله ورضي عنه ونفعنا الله بعلومه آمين. وينبغي انقلابه صحيحا ولو في المجلس ولو بعده فبيع التعاطي or فبيع بالتعاطي نهر. We were here last week and we were discussing how if a sale became fasid, in the instance of, we're talking about this issue of zira. If the sale became fasid, then there's a qawl, or there's Ibn Abidin rahimahullah, he just discusses, or rather up here it's Imam Haskafi rahimahullah, he discusses and he mentions that what if the fasad is removed? Okay. So he mentions, look, بقي لو تراضيا على تعيين الأذرع في مكان لم أره. If, because there was a debate initially that by dhira, what is meant? The actual wood or the measurement. So is it like saham or is it like the measurement? Now Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah was the view, no, it actually means the planks, right? And the thing that's being sold. And then he mentions, what if you correct this issue? And so he says, I've not seen this anywhere explicitly mentioned. But he says, look, وَيَنْبَغِي إِنْقِلَابُهُ صَحِيحًا لَوْ فِي الْمَجْلِسِ. If it's in the majlis, the transaction has not been settled, you're still in the majlis. Because remember, according to the Hanafiya, the transaction ends with ijab and qabul. And so as long as that's not happened and there's some kind of problematic issue, it's resolved before the majlis is over, then it's fine. However, if it's after the majlis, then according to the principles of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, that is taqarrur of fasad. The fasad now becomes embedded in the transaction. It's become severe as the two parties are no longer now discussing the transaction, and it's not deemed as a well, it'll be deemed as a completely different performance. When that's the case, the fasad is now has taqarrur in the actual transaction, and when it's now embedded and part of the transaction, if it can no longer be rectified. So Imam Rafi'i rahimahullah says that the asah seems that no, it should not be okay after the majlis. Whereas up here, Imam Haskafi rahimahullah saying, ينبغي انقلابه صحيحا, that it should perhaps be okay if it's في المجلس, and if it's after the فبيع بالتعاطي, you can consider بيع التعاطي, because when it's بيع التعاطي and you are re-performing an aqd by بيع التعاطي, then mutarakatul aqd is not necessary. You don't have to leave the old transaction. You can simply redo your ijab and qabul by mere delivery or giving, or just by the movement of things. You don't have to cancel the old transaction, and you don't have to, because the ta'ati just replaces the old transaction. However, Imam Rafi'i rahimahullah mentions that the asah should be that it does not, after the aqd, it should not be okay, because the principle of fasad becomes embedded in a transaction. So once the sale has taken place like this, it's a fasid transaction, the parties have separated, and then later on they want to rectify it, they can't simply rectify by bay'u ta'ati. They'll have to cancel the old transaction and then redo the transaction. So by cancelling the transaction, you are removing the fasad. You have to hence do mutarakatul aqd, of the first transaction. You have to cancel the transaction, and in that way, the fasad element which had become part of the aqd is also then removed. That's the objective here. That from a legal perspective, hukman, the fasad has now become embedded. There's no way to uplift that fasad except by leaving the old transaction altogether and redoing it. In fact, it's wajibur rafa'. when you have a transaction which is fasid, you must cancel it. And you must do fasq. Both parties have the opportunity and the right to do fasq of the aqd. And so both parties should do, whoever wants to do it can take the lead and do fasq of the aqd and initiate the kind of redoing of the transaction. Anyway, then he mentions اشترى عددا من قيمي ثيابا أو غنما جوهرة على أنه كذا فنقص أو زاد فسد للجهالة. ولو اشترى أرضا لأن فيها كذا نخلا مثمرا فإذا واحدة فيها لا تثمر فسد. He mentions up here a principle about qimiyat. See, when it's qimi items, it's different to the mithliyat items. What's different? What is different here in qimi? Remember, qimi simply means that every single item in the package or bundle is different. Every item is unique. So he gives two examples of thiyab, clothing, or ghanam, right? Your sheep. And the amount was different. So you had either less or you had more. Now, because every single item is different, then, and you sold it as a bundle, you don't know the actual individual prices of each unit because every unit is different and therefore its value should be different. It's not like a mithli item where if you have 10 and you sold for £10, you can simply assume that each one equates to £1. With qimiyat, you can't do that. And therefore, this ikhtilaf is mentioned, or these fara are mentioned, where if it's more or less, it's fasid in both scenarios. So, for example, if I purchased, the agreement was I'll buy 10 sheep or 10 different cloths, and it turned out to be 9, or it turned out to be 11. In both instances, it'll be fasid. But the reasoning in each is different. The underlying, that is jahala, lil jahala. Jahala is the underlying element and factor which is a problem here. And these principles go back to jahala, the concept of jahala. But the reason why, what leads, the road to jahala is different in both. And this is how furu work. Every fara is based upon an illa and ta'alil and a bina. There's a basis under every fara. And then under that bina, it's connecting to a wider, another tier. There's another tier, which is connected to a wider principle and asal of a bab. And then even under that, there's like a meta tier, which captures other usul. So the point of fiqh is to understand these tiers, how the furu are interacting with the usul of bina and the usul al-bab. And the usul of the bab are connecting with the usul of the abwab. And so there's like a tiered, like a lateral and horizontal kind of play going on here where different usul are interacting with different usul from different places. And a fara captures all of this. And that's where the fiqh is happening. The fiqh is happening beyond and behind the fara. The fara is just a capture of the asal and the usul. The furu are capturing the usul for us. And so in the furu is the investigation of fiqh. In the furu, we understand the fiqh that's happening underneath. And so even here, there's two fara, you could say, where in a scenario where it's sold for more and sold for less. Now, what's leading to jahala in both is different matters. So for example, in the first, where there's ziyada, there's jahala in the mabi. The mabi is majhul. How is the mabi majhul? Because you paid and agreed for 10, now there's 11. Which one is excluded? Which one is not part of the sale item? That's majhul. So your mabi becomes majhul because one of the 11 is going to be excluded. You don't know which one. So you don't know which 10 you're buying. And when you don't know which 10 you're buying, there's jahala in the mabi, and that creates fasad. Alternatively, when there is nuqsan and there's a deficiency in the sale items, that leads to a jahala in the thaman. Why does it lead to a jahala in the thaman? It's because now you only have 9, but you paid for 10. So, and you can't simply get a refund because you don't know the value of each one and the value of what was missing. So how do you work out? Because the item of each and the value of each qimi item, non-fungible item, is different. When the value of each non-fungible item is different, you can no longer work out the actual price. When you can't work out the price, I say, form of jahala. So that's why up here, that's also problematic. Then they mention another fara similar to this idea, and that's why it's just brought Imam al-Haskafi rahimahullah has just brought it in further to kind of support the asal underneath these furu. That وَلَوْ اشْتَرَى أَرْضًا لَأَنَّ فِيهَا كَذَا نَخْلًا مُثْمِرًا. If they had agreed to buy a land on condition, stipulated that there's this many nakhl muthmir, there's this many fruit-bearing trees, but they mentioned 10, but one of them was actually not fruit-bearing, then there's only 9 fruit-bearing. Then this would be fasid, because when you single out these trees, it became a part of the mabi. And so a part of the mabi is missing, which is the muthmir tree, the fruit-bearing tree. Because that was conditioned. That look, I'm buying this land on condition with these elements. So when it was mentioned ala anna fiha, it's now taken, it's become a stipulation and it's become maqsood and an objective and sought after requirement of for the sale. And when it's not the case, then the transaction becomes problematic because it's ma'doom. The mabi is ma'doom. When it's not muthmir, it's as though it's not there. And when the mabi is ma'doom, it can't be part of the aqd because it's ma'doom. There is no mabi. So it's not part of the aqd. And when it's not part of the aqd, then fasad, okay, it'll become fasid because you can't make the entire sale batil because there's still a sale taking place, but part of it is ma'doom. When part of it is ma'doom, then this is causes fasad in the transaction. Why does it cause it fasad? In this instance, it's fasid because the same idea that the thaman becomes majhul. Why does the thaman become majhul? The thaman becomes majhul because it was equated and made part of the sale transaction. Considering that every single tree is potentially, there's some differences in the tree and the fruits, then the tree that was missing and excluded, we don't know how to price that. And that will impact the entire transaction. It makes the thaman majhul, and therefore the aqd becomes fasid. So that's the thinking behind that particular fara. Then it's mentioned كما لو باع عدلا من الثياب أو غنما واستثنى واحدا بغير عينه فسد ولو بعينه جاز البيع خانية. If a bundle of clothing was sold or sheep was sold and one was excluded without specifying which one, again it'll be fasid. So we are again now playing on the same principle of fasad. Why? Remember, when something becomes fasid in a sale, it's going to be because of jahala primarily, right? There's a shart, it's a shart fasid, or there's jahala, right? These are things, it's fasid because of jahala. Now the jahala is going to be either in the mabi or the thaman, or this ta'liq of something. These are the elements which make, and we discussed this earlier, on what makes the things that make a bait fasid, right? We've discussed the core principles, and it'll definitely come again when we look at the chapter of Bay' al-Fasid. But Jahala will come either in the Thaman or either in the Mabi. Up here, what's happening, because you've done istithna, which is majhul, you don't know which particular item has been excluded. Therefore, there is Jahala, is ambiguity. When it's ambiguity of qimiyat, it's a qimi item, it's non-fungible. We don't know which one is excluded. And when you don't know which one is excluded, you don't know the price then of that. You don't know the price of the remaining items because one is not included. So what's the mabi and hence what's the price? We don't know. And therefore it becomes fasid. However, if a particular qimi or non-fungible item, cloth or sheep in this instance, was to be singled out and was to be identified, then it will not be fasid. It will not be fasid because we now know the exact one, and it's just like saying the actual amount without any. You don't have. There's no jahala. It's as though you're saying, you're not even mentioning the istithna. If you mention it, I'm selling you 11 except this particular one. It's as though you're saying that I'm just selling you 10 and this is the price. So you are not selling 11, you're selling 10 and the price is for the 10. And therefore there's no jahala. You know the 10 that you're buying. And so that will be fine. There's no problem. All of these examples are just going back to the principles of in qimiyat, non-fungible items, if there's ziyada or nuqsan, if you're giving more or giving less, or you've agreed on an amount, but there's ziyada or nuqsan, very likely it cause fasad of the transaction because you can't identify the price of the remaining items. When there's ziyada, it'll be jahala in the mabi. When there's nuqsan and there's less, there'll be jahala in the thaman. Okay, istithna, majhul, also a problem. Because when istithna comes in, we won't know the price either. And the mabi. They work together, right? You won't know. If you don't know the mabi, you don't know the price. Then he mentions that وَلَا بَيَّنَ ثَمَنَ كُلٍّ مِّنَ الْقِيمِيِّ بِأَنْ قَالَ كُلُّ ثَوْبٍ مِّنْهُ بِكَذَا. If he was to mention the price of every single qimi non-fungible item, so he specifies, look, every single one of these is this much, £1 each. وَنَقَصَ ثَوْبًا صَحَّ الْبَيْءُ بِقَدْرِهِ لِعَدَمِ الْجَهَالَةِ. When you specify and give every qimi item a price, then it's fine because every unit now has a price. Even though the unit is different, because every unit has now individually been given a price, then there's no jahala because we can simply say, okay, the total is X. So we're just trying to make sure there's no jahala in the transaction. That's the only concern here. Jahala is coming either in the thaman or mabi. As long as we are clear on thaman and mabi, then there's not a problem when it comes to jahala. وَخُيِّرَ لِتَفَرُّقِ السَّفَقَةِ. Okay. He'll be given khiyar. Now, in this instance, if there is some less, right? There was less because there was nuqsan and there was some deficiency in the amount delivered. He'll be given, the transaction will not be fasid, but he'll still get khiyar. Why? Because there's jahala yasira or there's tafarruq al-safaqa. How? What he had agreed to, he is not received. And whenever there's tafriq al-safaqa, it results in khiyar. In some instances of tafriq al-safaqa, it can become, there can be no sale, it can become fasid. But in this minor, when it's like jahala yasira or not a major issue, then it creates a just khiyar, just to cover up the deficiency that's there. So whenever there's jahala yasira, because there's nuqsan here, so he didn't get what he wants, there's tafriq al-safaqa, then he gets a khiyar just to not to make him disadvantaged, because he may want a specific amount. He may not want 9, he might want 10 exactly. Then the masla is mentioned that وَإِن زَادَ ثَوْبًا فَسَدَ لِجَهَالَةِ الْمَزِيدِ وَلَا رَدَّ الزَّائِدِ أَوْ عَزَلَهُ هَلْ يَحِلُّ لَهُ الْبَاقِي خِلَافٌ. This now is referring to if there was more. So every single cloth is singled out with a price, but you bought 10 only, but there's 11. The problem is, which 10 from the 11? Which 10 is it? Now, when that's the case, there's Jahalah in the Mabi, because one is not supposed to be there. So from the you don't know which 10 specifically you'll receive, because you've got 11 in front of you. One has to go from there, and that creates Jahalah, and that's why it becomes fasid. However, he mentions up here, what if a person was to simply just give one back from the 11? There's khilaf whether this is okay. According to, it's mentioned Bazaziyah and other books, that Imam Muhammad rahimahullah, his view was that it's okay to, well, there's two scenarios. One where if in a scenario where he's no longer with the seller, or the seller is absent, and he was to simply return one and use the rest, Imam Muhammad says istihsan, and this is okay because he's got milkiyah. He bought it, he's got milkiyah. Why should he go through harm and not be able to benefit from what's there? Because he bought it, but just that there's one extra. So the problem is in one. It's not really in 10. So although qiyas is that the transaction is fasid, there's an istihsan here of milkiyah being found, of darar being there for the buyer, of him not being able to use the item, of him not being able to even return the items if the seller is absent. So what does he do? He can't use the item, neither can he return the item. And that seems to be disadvantaging the buyer. And therefore, Imam Muhammad says, if he was to, in that scenario, give one back, yastamil al-baqi, use the rest, then he says it's fine, istihsanan. However, if the sale, and that istihsan is there, nadran al-mushtari, is there too for his benefit, because it seems to be, there's an imbalance there. The musawat is being shifted up here, because it can't be, it's unfair upon the mushtari that neither can return it, neither can use it. So you are imposing, if he was able to return it, then it's not unfair on the mushtari, because he can simply resolve the issue immediately. But up here, neither can he resolve and neither can he use. In both scenarios, he can't do anything, is left in limbo. That's not fair. Where you can't be in a scenario in a transaction where you're losing out both ways. That's why there's istihsan. Whereas in the qiyas is, if you can, then you don't have right to then override the fasad, because you have right to mend the fasad. So there's no need, and scenario of like darura or haja up here coming in, and istihsan coming in, basically, right? Because when you can return the sale item, okay, when you can return the sale item, then you're not being disadvantaged in any way, shape, or form. So in the scenario when the seller is present, then yes, the qiyas is you have to return and you have to resolve the matter and redo the transaction so that the fasad element is removed. Then he mentions ishtara thawban tatafawatu jawanibuhu falaw lam tatafawat kakirbasin lam tahilla lahu ziyada illam yadurrahu al-qat'u wa jaza bay'u dhira'in min. He mentions up here now, what if in the instance you buy a cloth which the sides are different, right? But then he mentions, look, فَلَوْ لَمْ تَتَفَاوَتْ, if the sides were not different, كَكِرْبَاسٍ, like a cloth, then the ziyada would not be valid if you can cut it and divide it, and you can remove the ziyada. وَجَازَ بِيعُ ذِرَاءٍ مِنْهُ, you can sell the extra, right? Then it won't be a problem, because the ziyada can be removed. So the masla will continue, the ishtara thawban tatafawatu jawanibuhu, it continues, but he just brought this middle section in, that falaw lam tatafawat, if it was not different, if the sides of the cloth were identical, and therefore cutting it, because it's all identical, you can't cut it. It's not going to cause a scenario where you won't be happy with what's left over, because when a cloth has different sides and it's different, when you cut it, it's going to spoil it. The seller might not be happy with what's been given, and the buyer might not be happy with what's left over, and that's why it causes harm when you cut. However, when it's not like that, it's identical, it's the same cloth all around, there's no harm in cutting it. It can be used. الذراع of it, وجاز بيع ذراع منه, you can sell also a الذراع of it. Then in that scenario, because it's all identical, then the ziyada is not valid. Okay, the ziyada will not be valid because there's no harm in doing qata and taqsim of it. But then the masala continues that اشترى ثوبا على أنه 10 أذرع كل ذراع بدرهم أخذه بعشرة في عشرة. Okay. So in this scenario, he's mentioning if and what's he talking about is if you single out the dhira. Remember, but aslan a dhira is wasf. It should have no thaman equated to it because it's a wasf. It's not the asl. The asl is a cloth, like we discussed last week. However, when you single out and you specify, you make the wasf the asl, like it's happening here. Kullu dhira'in bidirhamin. Then the transaction will take place according to what's there. Okay, the transaction will take place according to what's there. So he says, look, in this context, أخذه بعشرة في عشرة وزيادة نصف. If there is أناس بلا خيار, if there was 10.5, you'll only pay 10. You'll only pay 10. You'll have no khiyar either. But there's 10.5 being given to you. The reason why that is, the dhira was the asal. That was singled out, identified as the units. So that's in the hukm of asal. Each dhira has a thaman equated to it. However, nisf of dhira was not equated. It was not singled out. And therefore, anything less than 1 dhira is in the hukm of the asal of dhira, which is wasf. And that then goes back to the asal, and therefore it's got no qima and no value. That's why it'll only pay 10. There's no khiyar. Why is there no khiyar? Because لِأَنَّهُ أَنْفَعُ. This scenario is beneficial for him because in reality he's getting more. And khiyar only comes when there's a deficiency. So you don't get khiyar when you are benefiting. Like you buy an item which is an aib, it's ma'ib, it's got a deficiency, but it turns out to be salim and with salama. Then you don't get khiyar. Okay, so whenever you are benefiting over and above what was agreed, there's no khiyar because it's in your interest and your benefits. Khiyar comes to remove deficiencies. So to go from a deficiency to like the equilibrium and norm and status quo, not that you are benefiting, you have something better than to go down again, right? Then وَأَخَذَهُ بِتِسْعَةٍ فِي تِسْعَةٍ وَنِصْفٍ بِخِيَارٍ لِتَفَارُقِ السَّفَقَةِ. Yes, however, same principle, because there's half there. Half is not equated to any thaman, rather it's each dhira is equated, each unit, but you have 9.5. However, because it's less than what you wanted, you purchased, the ijab and qabul was on 10. That's why there's tafaruq as-safaqah, because the ijab was on 10 and qabul was on 10. You're being given 9 or 9.5. That's tafriq as-safaqah. What was agreed, what is being delivered is two different things. That's what is tafriq as-safaqah, and therefore you get khiyar. It's not enough to say it's fasid, because it's minor. You are paying 9, but so you're not being disadvantaged completely, and it's not like a gross disadvantage in fahish. Rather, it's minor. You're paying 9, you're getting 9.5, but what you really wanted is not there. That's why it's tafriq as-safaqah, but it's not strong enough to make the transaction fasid. Then he says, وقال محمد يأخذه في الأول بعشرة ونصف بالخيار وفي الثاني بتسعة ونصف به وهو أعدل الأقوال. Imam Muhammad rahimahullah is of the view, no, like just like you're giving the dhira, making a dhira an asal, then it follows that the nisf should also become asal, because you're singling out the actual measurements. And so it doesn't matter. You don't have to specifically mention nisf for it to be considered as an actual asal and unit. The fact that you are now moving your focus from the cloth to the measurements and the units shows that you're making the units the asal, and therefore you go with whatever's there. You pay according to whatever's being delivered to you. And Haskafi rahimahullah says this is A'dul Aqwal, as mentioned Bahar and other books, وأقره المصنف وغيره. Others have also given fatwa on this, like al-Atqani in Ghayatul Bayan. You can mention both Atqani and Itqani. It's a qasbah of Farab, and the scholars, especially those who specify in Tarajim and Buldan, they mention Atqan can be pronounced. There's quite a few books we mention Atqan bifath al-Hamza. However, the Imam Laknawi rahimahullah in his Al-Fawaid al-Bahiyya, he mentions this bikasr al-Hamza. So al-Itqani. The Muhaqqiq of Ghayat al-Bayan, in his tahqiq on Atqani's name, he mentions that the Musannif in his manuscript, which is Bikhatt al-Musannif, he himself had put a Hamza. That's an indicator. However, it's not really. Has there been any kind of edits in there? Has it been, somebody else has come and put it on? He mentions there it's with Bifath al-Alif. However, so the Muhaqqiq mentions that Bifath al-Hamza, but the Muhaqqiq mentions both are mentioned by the scholars when it comes to Tarajim and Buldan. Both have been narrated bil fath or bil kasr, and therefore he mentions both are permissible to mention. However, bi fath al hamza is more mashhur, and therefore he opts for al-Atqani. So Atqani in his Ghayat al-Bayan al-Sharh on Hidayah, he's also given fatwa on this, and he says وَبِهِ نَأْخُذْ. However, he says قلت لكن صحح القهستاني وغيره قول الإمام وعليه المتون فعليه الفتوى. Others like Qahustani, likewise in Zakhira, the qawl of Imam Abu Hanifa is asah. Like fatwa is given in tasheez then of the qawl of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. It's also mentioned elsewhere that the view of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah is mukhtar. Then he mentions فعليه الفتوى. What happens is, because based on the Usul of Iftaa, you have both views are musahah. So there's tasheeh, sarih tasheeh of both qawls. The qawl of Imam Muhammad and the qawl of Imam Abu Hanifa. And so now this is a mas'ala in the Usul of Iftaa of when there is two musahah qawl, what do you do? There's ikhtilaf in tasheeh. And so if we look at it, you have the qawl of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah on one side, and on the other side you have qawl of Imam Muhammad rahimahullah. But with the qawl of Imam Abu Hanifa, you also have وَعَلَيْهِ الْمُتُونَ. Mutun are stronger than shuruh and fatawa. And so when you have the qawl of Imam Sab rahimahullah against the qawl of Imam Muhammad, that's one indicator immediately. The qawl of Imam, right? That's one factor. When there's two qawls which are musahha, this is one factor to give strength to the qawl of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. A second factor is the fact that the mutun are on the view of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. And the mutun wa mawdu' li naql al-madhhab al-sahih. The whole point of the mutun was to do naql of the madhab, and therefore the rajih here then, or what is the most preferred and accepted view of the madhab would then be, based on these indicators, is the qawl of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, as is mentioned in the mutun themselves. Even Tumurtashi, what Tumurtashi has mentioned in his Tanwir, he's not mentioned the qawl of Muhammad rahimahullah, he's rather mentioned the qawl of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. That is the qawl of the mutun, and therefore fatwa is given on the qawl of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. We end here, inshallah. We'll continue with the next fasal. next week. Subhanallah bihamdihi, subhanallah.